Good afternoon, and welcome everybody to this edition of the UCL Lunch Hour Lectures. My name is Jakob Stoker-Nielsen. I'm from the School of European Languages, Culture and Society, and I'm very happy to introduce you to Maria Loh, who is a reader in the history of early modern Italian art and theory in the UCL Department of History of Art. She's going to talk to us about how artists such as Michelangelo and Titian became early modern celebrities. And the title of her talk today is Still Lives, Death, Desire, and the Portrait of the Old Masters. Very welcome.
Thank you very much. I've got a copy of my book, and what I would actually like you to do is to sign it. It's a kind of inverse book party, so if you could maybe sign in, you don't have to, you can sign a fake name. It's more a memento of the moment rather than some sort of UCL management exercise. It's just for my own interest as a memento of this moment, which in years to come I may just forget from my own lack of memory. Okay, so welcome and thank you. Can you not hear me? Oh, is this better? If I do this, I'll have to stand like this. If I do this, can you hear me or does my voice disappear again? It's no different. Okay, so what? No, it's okay. What we'll do is I'll use this as the world's smallest microphone and hold it like this. You can all hear me now, right? Okay, all right. Well, this is a very sweet, tiny microphone that I have now in my hand. And we will start. So let me turn the lights down a bit so we can see the images. Okay, is this okay? Everyone can hear me and can see and we're all set. Okay, so this is the cover of my book, the book that is coming around, Still Lives, which is in a sense from the material from which I will be speaking to you today about Renaissance artists as early modern celebrities. But I want to start somewhere slightly different and somewhat timely for today's lecture. I begin here in the summer of 2001. Hillary Clinton shared an important life lesson with the graduating class at Yale University. Hair, she said, matters. Your hair will send very important messages to those around you. It will tell people who you are and what you stand for, what hopes and dreams to have for the world. Pay attention to your hair, she said, because everyone else will. Now, Hillary knew this better than anyone else. The press had always watched the ups and downs of her hairstyles, as if the shifting hairdos she held would somehow be able to decode secret political messages. Now, hair may seem like a frivolous thing to focus on, but as I have told my students time and again, hair is historical. The history of style is closely linked to the history of hairstyles. Any of our first-year students should be able to tell you, those in the audience who aren't art historians, that the women of ancient Rome, like the powerful men with whom they were associated, were often identified by subsequent generations of historians by their hair. Here we see on the screen a selection of statues in the British Museum. When I went to check the other day, those rooms are sadly closed, but nevertheless, the next time they're open, you should most definitely go see them. On the bottom, we have Augustus with his wife, Livia, always identifiable by that tight bun, which other women in that period also imitated. We have Hadrian, who brought back the fashion of the Greek beard after many dynasties of clean-shaven emperors, and the woman formerly identified as his consort, but now possibly just a woman of that time, of Hadrian's time. And here we have the very tight curls of Lucius Verus, who, like Marcus Aurelius, introduced yet another style, and the more relaxed hairstyle of the women under their reign. Now, this is another clear example of how important being able to correlate history and style is through the detail of hair. Now, this is actually a slide that I prepared many years ago when I was teaching ancient Roman art, but I found in recent years it takes so long to explain who David Beckham is that it's really not worth it anymore. So this is the point about how celebrityhood has its ups and downs as well. But to return to Hillary. And so, in this historic week, as Hillary is about to claim the Democratic presidential nomination, we might reflect upon her words of wisdom. Hair matters. It will tell people who you are and what you stand for, what hopes and dreams to have for the world. In 2014, as she stepped down from her stint as Secretary of State to begin her long campaign for presidency, it could be said that her hair accessories announced to the world in a matter-of-fact, no-nonsense way, let's get down to business. What then might she have thought at this moment about the statement that was being made by this young woman? Now, I choose the year 2007 because this event happened, but also this is the year in which I began writing my book, the book that is coming around to you now. In the winter of 2007, Britney Spears was having a very, very bad hair day. A series of paparazzi photos were taken of her having a meltdown in a parking lot outside the Sherman Oaks tattoo parlor where she impulsively decided to shave her head. 2007 had been an intense year for the 26-year-old starlet. She filed for divorce, checked into rehab, and got into a custody battle over her children. She was not just having a bad hair day, but she was having a bad hair year. These things happen to the best of us, but unlike celebrities, there's usually nobody lurking outside of Whole Foods waiting to catch you in your scrubby tracksuit as you pop in on a Sunday morning to buy a pint of milk. If you decide to shave all of your hair off during a drug-fueled breakdown, as sometimes people do, nobody sells your photo to the press against your will. In the animated GIF on the left-hand side, we see poor Britney trying to get into her car as she is being besieged by photographers. Those pictures, the ones that were being taken by those flashbulbs, those pictures, she knew, would be in the tabloids by the next day. Perhaps her act of self-vandalism was an extreme attempt to try to gain some control over her own image before everyone else could manipulate it first. Now, this preamble leads me to a spectacular small self-portrait from the middle of the 16th century, painted by the aristocratic painter Sofonisba Anguissola. Still in her early 20s, so in other words, more or less the same age as Britney, Sofonisba Anguissola portrayed herself in this beautiful image in watercolors on parchment. The portrait was only 8 by 6.5 centimeters, which is about the size of an iPhone. In other words, it was a very small, intimate object that was meant to be shared between friends. In another painting, also by Sofonisba, we see the painter Giulio Clovio holding in his hand the portrait of the Flemish artist Lavinia Teerlink. It is an image of an image maker, depicted with the image of another image maker in his hand. And the whole thing was then made by yet another image maker. Hillary would certainly have approved of Sofonisba's self-portrait. Here on the right, in this Latin inscription, she identifies herself as a maiden, Virgo, from Cremona. This message is evident in both her self-image as well as the inscription that wraps around the outside border of the shield that she holds in her hands. It announces the maiden Sofonisba Anguissola, depicted in her own hand from a mirror at Cremona. With her hair carefully parted down the middle and pulled back in an elegant braid, she is asking us to take her seriously. And she was. Sofonisba was one of the most successful portraitists of her time. She was appointed the official court artist to the powerful Spanish king and queen. Furthermore, she was the most prolific and certainly the most inventive self-portraitist of her century. Here in this beautiful painting, we see her self-portrait as a painting on an easel, being painted by her former master, Bernardino Campi. Not only is she towering above him, but she has reduced him to painting the details on her dress, a task that was frequently handed over to the studio assistants. The double portrait here is both tender and cruel. On the one hand, it is a souvenir of Sofonisba's friendship and devotion to her master in those years, just as she was about to leave Italy and go to Spain. On the other hand, the hierarchy between master and student, between protector and protege, has been blurred by Sofonisba's superior skills. Now, I just wanted to point out very quickly that art historians have pointed out how Sofonisba has in fact painted Bernardino Campi in her very beautiful style, and she has painted herself in his rather mundane, clumsy style. Moreover, this is a gigantic portrait, so the scale of the two figures is rather symbolic here as well. The young prodigy, Sofonisba, would live a long and prosperous life. She lived a fairy tale existence long into her 90s with her second husband, Orazio Lomellino, the dashing young captain on the ship that would bring her back to Italy upon her retirement from the Spanish court. They lived in his palaces on her imperial pension, happily ever after. In the summer of 1624, Sofonisba received a special visitor at her palazzo in Palermo, a young up-and-coming contemporary artist named Antony van Dyck. He wished to paint a portrait of the blind but sprightly grande dame of painting. As they chatted, he sketched. While he sketched, he also jotted down copious notes, which you can see flowing around the image in the sketch. For instance, he noted that while she was making her portrait, she gave, and he writes, she gave me many instructions. First and foremost, she cautioned him not to position the lighting too high, or the shadows and the wrinkles of old age should become too strong. I hadn't thought about this. We should have negotiated this earlier. This is going out into the world, so. As an expert portraitist, Sofonisba knew well that she would one day have to live on through Van Dyck's portrait, and she wanted to make sure, as we all would, that he caught her good side. Like hair, the curation of one's own self-image mattered a lot. It was a life lesson that Hilary Brittany and Sofonisba knew all too well. Women are not the only ones to have bad hair days. Michelangelo probably did not expect his friend Giuliano Bugiardini to portray him in the headgear that he was known to wear while he was working. This sartorial accessory is sometimes misidentified as a turban, but in fact it is simply a piece of cloth that is wrapped around one's head that protects the artist from dust, and that also doubles as a rag for the blood, sweat, and tears that inevitably comes with the intense labor of sculpture. If you go to the quarries of Carrara today, you still see Italian quarrymen with that kind of headgear. And in fact, Michelangelo didn't like the portrait all that much. He said that Giuliano pretty much painted one of his eyes as if it was in the middle of his temple. And yet, this unloved image was copied widely and distributed by other artists for profit beyond the control of the artist. It is for this reason that painters like Sofonisba and Michelangelo can be thought of today as early modern celebrities. However, unlike most celebrities, artists were image makers themselves. The question then is this: what happens when image makers start becoming images themselves? And this is something that happens in the 16th century with the onset of reproductive media, such as print, as well as portrait medals. If in her own inscription, Sofonisba emphasized her role as an artist, if you recall, the inscription said, "I painted this," Sofonisba painted this in her own hand. Other artists, such as the anonymous portraitist in this medal in the British Museum, would reduce her identity instead to being Sofonisba, the daughter of Annibale Anguissola. Well, at least he got her signature braid correct. This was a problem, even for a consummate master such as Raphael. How many of you, just by a show of hands, have been to the Vatican and remember seeing the self-portrait in the School of Athens by Raphael? Okay, so some, yes. Many of you still have many things to look forward to. How many of you have been to the Louvre? Probably most of you. How many of you remember this portrait in the Louvre? Okay, not so many. Okay, not even one? Oh, poor Raphael. Okay, well, there you go. Many of you are probably familiar with his early youthful self-portraits, but here I show you one of his last self-portraits, painted sometime in his 30s. Here he is portrayed with an unidentified friend who gestures towards us in the future, looking back at the same time to address the face of the artist in the past. In the 16th century, this particular interpretation of Raphael would be copied by other artists. It was a very well-known image and appears, for instance, in this panel that is in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. Here you see him reproduced here alongside with Giotto, Donatello, Michelangelo, and Brunelleschi here. And this panel itself is based on another panel that's also in the Louvre, where Michelangelo and Raphael are replaced with earlier artists. So the point being that that particular version of Raphael's last self-portrait was well known in his time. Oops, sorry, slightly gone out of order now. But not all copyists would do such a good job, and in this print in the British Museum by Giulio Bonassone, we see evidence of how things could sometimes go very horribly wrong. If you compare these two versions here, the print and the self-portrait, it's kind of like looking at photos of celebrities with and without photoshopping. Here in the print, Raphael's hair is a limp, dull mess. His eyes are unfocused, and his lids are a bit too droopy. His beard is shaggy, uneven, and unkempt. His head is too square, and his shoulders too soft and rounded. Even his chemise seems to be making a mockery of him, slipping and sliding, pinching in all the wrong places. And what about the Venetian Renaissance old master, Titian? Possibly one of the most gifted portraitists of all time. Here he has been imprisoned on the left in the mask of a shriveled old man. If we compare this print, which appears in Giorgio Vasari's Lives of the Artists, to Titian's celebrated self-portrait in Berlin, we can see the difference. Vasari, who is not particularly fond of Venetian painting, has cut deep wrinkles across Titian's forehead. His eyebrows sit like deflated sacks above his expressionless eyes. His nose has become inexplicably bony, and his soft, elegant beard in the portrait has been reduced to grimy strands that hang around his mouth. His elegant skull cap is hidden beneath a large floppy hat that sits awkwardly on his head in the print like a mop. One does not need any documentary evidence to conclude that Titian would have been displeased with this portrait. I mean, who wouldn't? El Greco, for instance, found Vasari's portrait so hateful and unbearable that he inked it out of his lives. In the years shortly after Vasari's book came out, El Greco would take the opportunity to correct the wrong by painting Titian's portrait into the corner of a religious scene in the company of Michelangelo, Giulio, Clovio, and Raphael. As we can see, El Greco's model was Titian's own self-portrait, so far from Vasari's hack job. Vasari is, of course, an immensely important figure in this story, and I don't want to undervalue that point. His biographies of the artists, which came out first in 1550 and then again in 1568, the subsequent edition had the portraits in them, his biographies of the artists made artists worthy of having biographies at all. But not all artists were necessarily in agreement with his version of things. And things can sometimes get very ugly when artists start talking about other artists, and that has not changed. Federico Zuccaro, the director of the Art Academy in Rome at the end of the 16th century, wrote in his copy of Vasari that the author was a phony friend and a terrible gossip. Other artists said far worse. Do I need to give a trigger warning for obscenity? No, I think not. One wrote in the margins of his book that he was a prick, coglione. Another called him a ravenello, a radish head. Another 16th century reader noted that Vasari spouted gibberish that, quote, even the mouth of an oven wouldn't say, end quote. This seemed to be a theme because Annibale Carracci similarly complained that that presumptuous man says things even an ass wouldn't say. Annibale Carracci's copy of Vasari's Lives is preserved in a library in Bologna that you can go and call up and see for yourself. The marginalia is an absolute delight to go through. More than any other early modern reader, Annibale found Vasari's bragging and self-importance really hard to take, and his anger exploded all over the margins of his book. Words are crossed out, ink bleeds and blots as the shifting penmanship betrays the growing agitation of the commentator. On one page, Annibale underlines Vasari, 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 so on and so forth, 20 times to demonstrate just how many times Vasari refers to himself. On other pages in rapid succession, Annibale calls Vasari ignorant, malicious, presumptuous, a jealous liar, a charlatan, one of my favorite, a gnome, shameless. In one passage, Annibale explodes, "Ok viso di cazzo," what a dick face. And then, when he arrives to the actual page of Vasari's autobiography, Annibale really loses it and slashes the author's face with the sharp nib of his pen. It is hard to imagine Annibale Carracci, the artist often pitted by art historians as Caravaggio's classical, traditional counterpart. It is hard to imagine Annibale getting so worked up reading Vasari's Lives of the Artists. But perhaps it was because he knew all too well that one's portrait, whether in word or image, would survive long after the artist himself could no longer hold on. Annibale was perhaps especially aware of this condition as he painted his self-portrait in the early years of the 1600s. These would be his final years, and they were sad, lonely, melancholic ones. In 1602, Annibale's brother Agostino died and left him to fend for himself in the poisonous, competitive, petty Roman art world. His rivals badmouthed him, and his patron lost confidence in him. He was gypped of his payment for the fantastic Farnese Gallery. He was in a state of severe physical exhaustion and emotional depression following several difficult commissions that went unrewarded. In these days, Annibale Carracci was living in a small house with his nephew and some of his students. He felt unable to paint or even to draw, and there's actually a very lovely drawing by some of his students, and on the back you have this very sweet and tender contract between Annibale Carracci and three of his students, where they promise each other they would or they would draw a certain number of drawings together each day as a way to almost support their master. Some of my students are here, so one day I'll be asking you to do that for me. It is easy to read this painting as the testament of someone who's letting go of everything and who is letting everything go as well. Just as an aside, this is such a fantastic image, and it's one of those paintings that when you show modernists, art historians of a later period, they always insist, oh, that can't possibly be from the Renaissance. Nobody did anything like that in the Renaissance. But this is such a fantastic reflection on that process of what it means to become an image. What we have is Annibale Carracci's self-portrait on this easel, and you have the palette that faces out directly at the viewer with actual daubs of paint on it. So there's a wonderful moment where reality and representation kind of collapse into each other. On the one side, you have a sleeping cat, which is often seen as a symbol or a sign of negligence. On the other side, you have this dog who, again, stares out at the audience, much like the portrait of Annibale, because the dog is associated with ideas of loyalty, of fidelity, everything that one would hope one's portrait might be, as opposed to the negligent cat. And then in the background, you have this strange figure that is standing on the threshold of something. It's unclear as to whether he's standing at a window looking out or looking in, or whether that's a ray of sunlight that has projected itself to the back wall of the studio. And there's something kind of lovely about that ambiguity that is no more clear than the fact that the face that stares out at us that we can read so well is also just a bunch of paint on a surface, much like the palette here. So this kind of wonderful mise en abîme, as academics often describe it, that kind of sets into, that thematizes this very process of letting go. Oops. Are we still here? Okay. And yet, this poignant self-portrait, in this poignant self-portrait, we find, in a sense, more than just that. On par with Sofonisba's self-portrait with Bernardino Campi, Annibal's self-portrait as a portrait on an easel is perhaps one of the most profound meditations by an image maker on the existential force of images, what images can do, the work of art, the labor, the philosophy of art. There is so much more than just hair at risk here. The portrait was meant to preserve the individual's reputation against all the unexpected bad hair days that might have come and gone, and the ones still yet to come. Against the slander, the petty rivalries, and the false rumors, the artist's self-image was the image that would survive and speak on his behalf when he no longer could. And in this regard, the portrait of the artist was an exquisite, undying, still life. Now, I didn't want to end quite on this slightly melancholic and morbid note here, so I wanted to show you what I just read yesterday in The Guardian. She's never going to escape it. This was just yesterday, 2nd of March, 2016. They're still scrutinizing poor Hillary's hair, and even The Guardian was pondering whether Hillary should come out and embrace her inner éminence grise as she approaches the final stretch of the elections. But this is just another instance to underline how important the public image of the individual, in this case a politician, which is now a form of celebrity, but also in the 16th century at this moment when the technologies of print and other reproductive media enabled the artist too to become a celebrity. And I think with that I'll end in case there's some questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. We have some circulating microphones, so if you have a question, put up your hand and wait for a microphone to arrive.
Yes. Maybe I'll keep holding this.
Thank you for your lecture. Very good. I just wanted to comment, really. I enjoyed all of that. Maybe for your last slide, you might add one of Mary Beard.
Ah, okay. Oh, well, Mary Beard, yes. I mean, Mary Beard is a kind of, treasured public intellectual in this country, but I wonder how many of the students know what she looks like. I know her voice, but I'm not 100% I could pick her out in a lineup myself.
She's doing a program
on
Grey.
Yeah.
Women dye their hair grey. Dye their hair, not leave it grey.
Yeah.
Because she steadfastly clings to her identity as an older woman
Yeah.
with grey hair.
Yeah. Is this? Oh my God. Do we have enough time in the world for that? I leave that phenomenon to the physicists to decipher. Do you even think that's hair? Oh wait, this is going to go online. Sorry, I didn't say that. I don't want a whole bunch of hate comments on my YouTube page. I mean, I recently read a piece on Sarah Palin and her mustache, because apparently she had been photographed with some facial hair or whatever it was. And as a predictably left-leaning academic, there was a moment of schadenfreude, but also as a woman of the 21st century, it did fill me with a bit of sadness that should even be an issue. So, you know, it is something that you occasionally hear some minister or somebody or another has had a 200-pound haircut, and that is pretty much the extent of the outrage. But the actual charting of styles, you know, what could Michelle Obama's bangs possibly mean? You know, what is this? Is this a softer image? Is she trying to, you know, all these types of reflections that focus on the image of the celebrity is something that has always perhaps been more directed by external agents onto the image of women. But do we have other portraits of Michelangelo? There are many portraits by other artists of Michelangelo, but in fact, he himself was not much of a self-portraitist. There is a kind of half-chiseled face in the Pietà that is in Florence that Vasari, later, after Michelangelo's death, identifies as a portrait of Michelangelo by Michelangelo. But to a certain extent, he was not very fond of portraiture. I don't know why. And this is something very interesting, and I think I've pointed this out certainly to my students before. There are very few sculpted self-portraits in the early modern, in the 16th, 17th centuries. And this is a very strange blip. Bernini paints himself on more than one occasion. We have very beautiful painted portraits of Bernini, but he never sculpted himself. Baccio Bandinelli, who's an exception to everything, sculpted an extravagant self-portrait for his tomb in imitation of Michelangelo's Pietà. But Bandinelli is an exception to the rule. And I suppose one of my questions about that absence is whether sculpture as a medium was slightly just too close to funerary traditions, how, you know, turning the self into a three-dimensional avatar was perhaps just slightly too much for the 16th century to handle. But that's you know, the sculpted self-portrait would be a wonderful thesis topic for someone. Northern artists tend to do it more than Italian artists.
Further questions? Otherwise, I have one. It's fascinating to see how long this history of this wish to control one's own image is, and the difficulties of controlling one's image. But I was wondering if you see any major differences between sort of a pre-mechanical reproduction era and probably what we recognize as a modernity of celebrity, sort of with the photograph and democratization of the image. Is there a major difference in terms of how they use self-portraiture to control their own image? And was it more than just their looks? I mean, controlling your own image, does it also mean that they wanted to control how their works were perceived or how they're perceived as artists?
I mean, certainly for someone like Michelangelo, he poured all of that psychic energy into his poetry. So he is someone who wrote extensive collections of sonnets and other forms of poetry. And that was in a sense, a kind of textual self-portrait. That is the medium through which he tried to communicate his inner identity, which was a profoundly spiritual one in that period. But I suppose it has to do with the conjunction of a desire for portraiture and the technologies that enable the kind of replication and circulation of that unique image in a multiple manner. And to that extent, the 16th century is so interesting because it's a century in which we don't think of oil painting as, you know, high-tech media. But certainly for the 16th century, the ability to paint these translucent glazes that, you know, would almost make the surface of the sitter's skin seem to be breathing or palpitating. This is how it's often described in 16th century texts. Oil painting was considered a new media, like CGI for us, I suppose now, that made portraits seem that much more real than in the past. You have an increase in travel that takes place in the 16th century between just business wars, exploration, etc. So people also become more absent from their homes, from their towns, from their areas. And portraits are often used as surrogates in those moments of absence, rather than just a commemoration of someone famous and dead, which for so long, that is what portraiture was reserved for. The poet Pietro Bembo wrote this very beautiful but fake letter from his wife to him, in which he says that his wife is sitting there at home with their young son, gazing at the portrait of him in his absence, and how they miss him, and they talk to the portrait, etc. So there is this idea that portraiture as a genre comes into its own in the 16th century. The technique of oil painting, as well as the reproductive technologies of printing and everything else, also come in at that moment. Vasari's lives make it interesting to know the lives and the stories of artists, and how these people who were essentially artisans could be suddenly rubbing shoulders with the King of France or the King of Spain, etc. So it is a kind of very special, unique moment historically, in which various different things happen to coincide.
But what would some of those things be? Why in the Renaissance, apart from the invention of particular technologies for reproduction, is there anything else that begins this sort of celebrity culture in Italy possibly at this time?
Well, the most famous celebrity, because it's also so close to notoriety. I mean, the most famous early 16th century celebrity is, of course, Calvin. And these are portraits that are painted because people either love Calvin or hate them. Statue of the bronze statue of where is he? The bronze statue of no. The bronze statue, no? Oh, God. If this stays on the screen too long, we might have to pay image rights or something. Okay, the bronze statue of Augustus, for instance, was actually, I've forgotten now the history of it exactly, but it was actually buried in the threshold of a temple, so that people would have to step over his head every time they entered. So, images are very... They preserve you, but they can also betray you very, very quickly and easily. It worries me that this moment, my face, this, is captured forever in YouTube because it goes out into the world, and then it's beyond your control. And in a sense, it's no longer you anyways. It's just an image of you.
Thank you. Do you have a question here?
Would you or could you comment on ancient coinage and the portraiture on them in relation to the Renaissance? In other words, Alexander the Great's coinage spread worldwide at that time.
Absolutely. I mean, coins like the portrait medals that became popular again in the late 15th, early 16th century were a means of reproducing an image, an authoritative image, in a format that was associated with antiquity, portraits of emperors. If you think of all of the many portraits of emperors on coins, the British Museum has a wonderful collection. That was a means of distributing one's likeness. Medals, coins are a lot more expensive than prints. Prints accomplish that, and you can make it in a profile format very quickly. And so, in a sense, that new technology was, again, favored over the more elite and more time-consuming and material-demanding medium of metal portraiture. But certainly, the kind of antiquarian interest in collecting ancient medals and coins does perhaps feed into certain ideas about portraiture as well in this period. But for an artist to paint him or herself in profile means that they have to already see themselves from a natural view. The more common self-portrait is more or less the position of the artist standing in front of the reflective surface and copying what they see before it. So, Titian paints a profile portrait that is in Madrid that is really quite incredible. But, I think it's something like, cutting your hair in a mirror, and you have to be able to understand which direction things are going in and to understand the different angles that you're looking at. But certainly medals and coins do play a part in this history.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're running out of time. This has been a wonderful lesson in celebrity culture. We've been from presidential candidates to Titian. It's been a wonderful day. Thank you very much, and please join me in thanking Dr. Maria Loh.
Thank you.